Okay, let's get going. Hello, everybody. Welcome. I'm Joan Ingersoll. I'm the Director of the Council on Aging, and we are really excited to welcome back Barry Pell for his third presentation with the COA. I'm sure many of you have enjoyed his previous two presentations. If you could please mute yourself for the presentation, there'll be an opportunity to ask questions at the end. And also you can put questions into the chat box if you want, and we'll be monitoring that either way. But that would be greatly appreciated. Barry is a world traveler and photojournalist. He's traveled widely over 5 decades, visiting and documenting landscapes and cultures in nearly 170 countries on all continents. He's lived and traveled in China, Eastern Europe, North Africa, and South America, and he lectures on international cultures at schools, universities, libraries, and community centers. Today, he's talking to us about the Gullah Geechee people of the Barrier Islands. So with no further ado, welcome, Barry.
Thank you, Joan. It's a pleasure to return to the COA, and thank you all for attending this Zoom program. Hopefully in the next time that I present, we'll be able to be face-to-face once more. That would be a pleasure. So this is, as Joan indicated, a photographic presentation entitled Gullah Geechee, African Communities on the Barrier Islands of the American South. And the program is based on my travels along coastal Georgia and South Carolina that I took just a few months ago. Now, as some of you may be familiar with my programs, they usually are about places internationally that I visited around the world. But because of the coronavirus travel restrictions on international travel, I've been taking trips in the United States to places which I would also say have very rich cultural and historical significance. So the Barrier Islands along the Atlantic Ocean coast extend essentially from North Florida to the Carolinas, and they are a very rich area culturally and historically. The islands and the adjoining coast were, prior to the Civil War, developed as predominantly rice plantations, and their economic prosperity was enabled by the forced labor of enslaved people stolen from countries in West Africa. Now, these plantations succeeded because the slaves who were brought over had skills that they had been using and developed on their rice farms in Africa. And with their freedom after the Civil War, many of these communities continued. And as they were quite isolated within the remote coastal Barrier Islands, the residents developed a distinctive culture, which became known as Gullah Geechee. So in this program, what I'd like to do is to discuss the history of the region, which is also known as the Low Country because it's very low above sea level, and explain how the freed slaves evolved, their special culture, and how their communities are now coping with pressures from developers who have today recognized the land's beauty and appeal, and which therefore have become a threat to the preservation of the communities of the Gullah Geechee and their African roots. So first off, let me just show you a map just for a little bit of orientation. And that is here. Hopefully you can all see that. So the corridor where the Gullah Geechee mostly settled, and which, by the way, has been established now by the US Congress as the Gullah Geechee Cultural Heritage Corridor, extends along many of the islands from approximately St. Augustine, Florida, up to almost Jacksonville, North Carolina, and encompassing Georgia and South Carolina, as well as parts of Florida and North Carolina, and also extends back into the Low Country about 30 miles from the coast. A total distance of about a length of about 500 miles. So that gives you a little orientation as to where we will be speaking about. And we can now go to the images. Okay. So first of all, a little background on the ecology of Barrier Islands. Well, Barrier Islands are essentially coastal landforms that are created by the wave and tidal action along the coast of the mainland. They usually occur in groups, archipelagos, and as their name implies, the islands act as a barrier to protect the mainland by absorbing the energy of storms, waves, and sea fluctuations. A barrier island chain may include dozens of islands, as do the barrier islands of the Atlantic coast in the US, and they may extend uninterrupted over more than 100 miles. Well, behind the barrier islands, within the flooded areas between the islands and the mainland, and also among the islands themselves, there are tidal inlets where the seawater will rush around them. And wetlands like this can then flourish. Now, wetlands are considered the most biologically diverse of all ecosystems. They support lots of life. They are characterized by vegetation of aquatic plants, and they support a rich range of waterfowl, for example, and wading birds, as well as animals and insects and fish and shellfish. Now, the water in those wetlands behind the barrier islands can be one of three types. It can be entirely salt water because of the sea, the Atlantic Ocean, that rushes in behind them. It could also be largely fresh water because of the rivers that flow from the inland areas and fill those open spaces, or they can be a combination. They can be what's known as brackish, that is a combination of salt and fresh water. And the wetland types that exist are defined in a number of ways, depending on exactly what they contain. They are variously referred to as swamps or marshes, bogs, and mangroves, among others. So barrier islands then, essentially, they're a form of sand dune system where the waves have pounded along from the ocean along the coast and lifted up some of the sediment at the bottom of the ocean to create these flat or slightly lumpy barrier islands. Occasionally, the sand buildup is so great that an island will become attached to the mainland, thus transforming it from an island into a peninsula. And the wetlands behind the barrier islands may contain clay and sand sediments carried by the incoming tides. And so here on this map, you see a representation of many of those well-known islands. Now, chains of barrier islands are not unique, of course, to the Atlantic coast of the US. They exist along many of the world's coastlines. And on the Atlantic Ocean coast of southeastern United States, including South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida, the barrier island chain numbers over 100. They're also referred to as the sea islands. And together with the mainland coast, extending perhaps as much as 30 miles inland from the islands, the entire region is referred to as the Low Country. So my wife and I traveled to the barrier islands of Georgia and South Carolina during the early spring. Their physical beauty is in the diversity of the terrain, from beaches to wetlands to marine forest. And this image gives you a little bit of a sense of the cross-section of what that ecology looks like. So this is the Atlantic Ocean side over here, and then you have the buildup of a barrier island, which then protects a tidal creek, some of those estuaries and wetlands I referred to. And then you might have a levee, which also acts to protect the mainland. And then a series of marshes that have different types of vegetation and rising elevation, eventually then transitioning to some larger bushes and trees until you finally get to an upland forest, a more mature forest with some of the very large trees that are very evocative and distinctive and iconic of the American South. So the east or the ocean side of the islands is directly exposed to the Atlantic Ocean, and it's filled with expansive beaches of fine white sand and rolling sand dunes. And it is these dunes and the shallow slope of the continental shelf just offshore that serves to protect the mainland from storms and the strongest winds. But the ocean side of the barrier islands is the part that takes the brunt of those storms and then absorbs the power of the ocean before it can damage anything further inland. And one of the evidences of that strength of the incoming ocean is on an island called Jekyll Island in Georgia, where right on the coast, on the Atlantic side of the coast, which takes all the winds, you have the remains of skeletons, very atmospheric skeletons of uprooted trees, which are evidence of the power of tropical storms that blow in across the Atlantic and which the barrier islands then serve to protect the rest of the mainland. So on the west side, the protected side of the barrier islands, you will find the more calm water of salt marshes and an interconnected maze of meandering waterways, which may be lined with broad expanses of tall grasses. These grasses are called sea oats or needle rush, and they are quite picturesque, gleaming in the sunshine and swaying in the breezes. Now, perhaps the most distinctive feature of the island's vegetation is further inland, the upland forests that I referred to, the mature forests, which are forests of pines, oaks, magnolias, and cedars. And in particular, it is the oak tree, which is a species here referred to as live oak, because although oaks are generally deciduous, a live oak is an evergreen, and therefore keeps its leaves through the year and does not drop those leaves. It stays with its leaves all year. And of course, these live oak trees are an indelible image of the Old South. Well, the oldest of these enormous stately trees with their burly trunks are estimated to be between several hundred and over 1,000 years old. And one of the factors that assists in their survival and their age is the fact that they have grown tolerant to salt spray, because there is a lot of salt coming in off the ocean. And that makes them adaptable and very excellent to grow and survive and thrive in the barrier island atmosphere. And the huge branches of a live oak festooned with soft Spanish moss and spreading horizontally over grassy lawns, well, this certainly is an iconic image, again, of the Old South. Now, historically, these areas, the sea islands, were settled by indigenous cultures, Native Americans, including the Gullah and Mocama chieftains over thousands of years. European colonists began to arrive in the 16th and 17th centuries, the Spanish first in the 16th, the English after them, and they began to disrupt and eventually displace the Native American societies. Now, these are the remains from the early 1700s of a colonial estate of the first group of English settlers who arrived in Georgia. And at that time, there was an abundance of oysters in the waters off the barrier islands. And there was a popular construction method used by both the British and the Spanish to make use of the abundant supply of these oyster shells right in the walls of their buildings. And a type of concrete was fashioned called tabby, which was made by burning the oyster shells to create lime and then mixing it with water, sand, ash, and more broken shells. And you could see the remnants of one of those walls here and an uncovered section of wall where you can still make out the oyster shells that were used very popularly in their construction. Well, as you might imagine, of course, when the Spanish settled and the English began to settle, there were territorial wars that broke out between the Spanish. From their southern base, they were predominantly located in Florida, and the British, often assisted by indigenous tribes, and they were mostly settled in the northern forts in present-day South Carolina. And so the land in between, shown here in shading, in the crosshatch shading, was the battleground, was the area where the British from the north and the Spanish from the south fought for control of the region. And by the 1700s, as we all know, Spain ceded its territory of Florida to Great Britain. Now, the first ship with enslaved African people, which numbered about 20, was brought to the American British colonies in the year 1619. This number brought to the United States eventually reached some 500,000 who were forcibly taken over the next 200 years. Of course, millions more Africans were kidnapped from their villages and taken to other parts of the New World, the Caribbean and South America, as well as nations in the Indian Ocean. Now, one of the important dates in the slave trade is the year 1808, because in that year, the importation of captured and enslaved Africans was banned in the United States. Now, this date, 1808, was actually a compromise between Northern abolitionists who wanted to stop importation immediately when the Constitution was ratified in 1788, and the Southern slaveholders who insisted on another 20 years as a condition to support the American Constitution. And so 1808 then became the date after which no new slaves, it didn't abolish slavery, but no new Africans were by law supposed to be imported from Africa. Of course, many illegal ships still continued to arrive. Now, this is a memorial to the slave trade. Notice the chains at their feet along the river in downtown Savannah, Georgia. And the base of this memorial has a quotation by Maya Angelou describing the brutal conditions aboard slave ships. And by the way, the port of Savannah, where this memorial is located, was a major receiver of enslaved West Africans after Georgia legalized slavery in 1750. So this date, 1808, is quite important because not only did it legally attempt to stop the importation of new slaves, but accordingly, it also affected how slaves were treated. And that is that before 1808, the plantation owners, the white plantation owners, knew that they had an endless supply of enslaved Africans that they could bring into the United States. As a result, their treatment was particularly harsh, resulting in very short lifespans, since the plantation owners knew it didn't matter. If they died, they could always get new slaves from Africa and bring them in by ship. After the importation ban, although, as I say, some illegal ship arrivals still occurred, and all the way up to the Civil War, white slave owners had to modify their tactics, and instead they worked with the slaves who they already had here, and they encouraged or even fathered breed stock children to maintain the enslaved population. Now, there's another distinction of the American slave system. In a lot of the world, when people were taken as slaves, their children automatically became free. In the United States, the system worked differently because slaves were defined as chattel or property, and thus their offspring also fell under enslavement. Now, agricultural plantations, some of enormous acreage, began to be developed throughout the South, and the crops they cultivated included things like cotton and rice and indigo, which is a plant used to make blue dye. And these crops were heavily labor intensive. And for the most part, these agricultural businesses could not have profitably survived without the free labor extracted from enslaved Africans. Now, plantations also spread to the barrier islands of the South and the adjacent coast. And by the late 1700s, the exports of indigo dwindled, but two crops remained, and those were cotton and rice. Especially rice became the dominant crop of the Low Country plantation. And this is the Romanesque style cotton exchange building in downtown Savannah, which was built in 1887 when the city was the primary cotton seaport on the Atlantic coast. And so the Barrier Islands became known for a particular species of cotton known as Sea Island cotton. And it was the most in demand. It was highly prized because its particularly long fibers allow it to be woven at the very highest yarn count. And so basically the longer the fibers, the more luxurious the cotton in terms of strength, luster, and soft feel. But even cotton began to diminish in importance. It was instead the successful production of rice on the coastal Barrier Islands, which succeeded because the cultivation drew on the skills that slaves brought with them from their farms in Africa. And this ultimately led to the shaping of unified communities and culture in the United States known as Gullah and Geechee. Well, during the 1700s, the American colonists in Georgia and the Carolinas discovered that rice would grow well in the moist semi-tropical country bordering their coastline. But the colonists, frankly, had no experience with the cultivation of rice. They needed Africans who knew how to plant, harvest, and process this difficult crop. And as a result, the white plantation owners purchased slaves from various parts of Africa, but they greatly preferred and paid a premium for Africans from what they referred to as the Rice Coast, as we look at this map of West Africa. And this had been the traditional rice growing region of the continent, stretching down from Senegal in the north to Sierra Leone and Liberia. Well, the plantation owners, as I say, were willing to pay higher prices for Africans from this area who brought with them expert rice cultivation skills. Enslaved Africans from the Rice Coast were therefore the largest group brought into South Carolina and Georgia during the 18th century. But rice cultivation is not easy. The fields for the cultivation of the crop require the use of fresh water. And the fresh water is mostly found inland next to the rivers, whereas the transport of the crop has to be done along the Atlantic Ocean on ships that would then go to the major urban centers where the rice markets were. Consequently, you see this map of the property lines of many of the early plantations. And notice how unusual they are, because these properties were very narrow and very wide. And that's because the rice fields, the owners needed to get access to the fresh water from the rivers that were 30 miles or more inland from the coast. But then once the rice was cultivated in fields that were close to the river, they needed to be transported across their property over to the ocean, where they could then be transported to the markets for sale. So that's why they had these unusual property boundaries. Now, Africans had developed in their villages in West Africa a system of canals and dikes which were able to channel and control the flow of fresh water in and out of the rice fields. And the system was transferred, the skills to do this were transferred entirely to the low country of Georgia and South Carolina, where they also worked very, very well. The rice growing system that enslaved Africans brought to the Barrier Islands also included a gender division of labor that replicated what had existed in West African culture. So for example, it was the men who were responsible for building these canals and rice fields, as well as flooding and draining the fields and protecting the crops from animals. The women were responsible for planting, weeding, harvesting, threshing, and polishing the rice. And so that system of gender differentiation was also brought and applied to the enslaved plantations of the Americas. And this is a photo of present-day rice planting by women in Africa that I took when I visited the rice coast there. Well, in the 18th and 19th centuries, again, as a consequence of the free labor of the enslaved Africans, rice created more wealth in South Carolina and Georgia than any other crop. And by 1860, plantations were producing more than 14 million pounds of rice every year. California gold rice made white people immensely wealthy. They were taking advantage of the knowledge and labor of enslaved Africans who were relied upon for their technical engineering and managerial skills to produce what became the region's most valuable export. It was not easy work. Enslaved Africans had to labor in waist-deep swampy water to construct the irrigation system and cultivate the rice. These waters were swarmed by malarial mosquitoes and infested with alligators. The Africans built earthen channels, which required frequent maintenance to channel and direct the fresh water. And today, many of these channels still exist, as well as some of the dikes from that time, either in their original form or rebuilt. And of course, the alligators also still exist. However, the profitability of rice for the plantation owners was largely dependent on having free slave labor. Consequently, by the end of the Civil War, production started a long decline, and worsened by several storms, rice farming disappeared altogether by the early 1900s. This chimney and small plantation house are, as an example, all that remains of the 1,600-acre Butler Island rice plantation in Darien, Georgia. Now, from their time of arrival in the coastal lowcountry, and despite having been kidnapped from many different tribes speaking different languages, enslaved Africans started to create cohesive communities. Their lives were less controlled than on other plantations further inland because the white planter families, well, they mostly stayed away from the barrier islands because there was lots of malaria there, and because these islands were remote from their social circles, and so they ran them from afar. They were sort of absentee landlords. As a result, the Africans developed more freedom. In addition, many of the Africans had a more natural immunity to malaria that thrived in the marshes. So the large number of slaves working on the low country plantations therefore had more limited interaction with the whites. And that prompted them to have some independence and also enabled them to develop their own distinct culture without interference from the white plantation families. Now, in contrast, in much of the inland South, especially where sugar and tobacco were cultivated, these crops required very close supervision by the plantation owners. And the slaves also worked on a gang system in which they were required to work continuously for 10 hours a day or more for the benefit of the white owners. And the system further inland was brutal. It forced the slaves to work until the owner said they were finished. It allowed them almost no freedom. In contrast, the enslaved people on the rice and Sea Island cotton plantations worked not on a limitless gang system of long hours, but they worked on what is known as a task system. And in this system, the worker was released when his assigned task for the day was completed. Much more benevolent system. Under this system, a slave could then cultivate a certain measure of land, normally a quarter acre, and had the rest of the day to him or herself after completing their assigned task. Well, this system, especially for rice, worked well. It also required little supervision of the ethnic groups who had specialized skills in traditional African rice cultivation. And so once their assigned task was completed, they could pursue other activities, such as tending their own subsistence crops, hunting, or fishing. And in this way, they might accumulate money and personal property, and that validated their self-worth, fostered a sense of community, and enabled some of them eventually to buy their freedom. So it led, as I say, to a successful ability for many of the enslaved Barrier Island people to use their skills as a bargaining chip to determine the length and conditions of their bondage in the Americas. Many of them became freedmen, and pictured here is the Laurel Grove Cemetery in Savannah, Georgia, which is the final resting place of many Blacks who indeed were able to become freedmen before the Civil War and very successful economically. Now, during the Civil War, the Union forces occupied the Barrier Islands, one of the first places in the country where they did take over and take control of the white plantations. And the plantation owners fled to locations. Typically, they fled to the mainland, some of the bigger cities where they were still in charge, building homes like this in Charleston, for example, which still stand today. And usually they left behind their slaves. And so immediately then, the slaves were able to run their own lives. And that also strengthened their close-knit community and culture. Well, after President Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, more than 5,000 slaves on the Union-occupied Barrier Islands obtained their freedom. They, as I say, were the first freed slaves in the South. And they hoped to be given land as compensation for having worked it for so many years under slavery. Indeed, there was a wartime order which allotted land in the Barrier Islands and adjacent coast of Georgia and South Carolina for Black settlement. Each family was given 40 acres and was loaned Army mules for cultivation. Within 6 months, this policy, which became known as 40 acres and a mule, had distributed 400,000 acres of coastal land among 40,000 former slaves. Unfortunately, Lincoln's successor as president, Andrew Johnson, who was a known racist, ended this land redistribution and generally returned many of the properties to the planters. But many of the freedmen stayed in the coastal and Barrier Islands. They claimed land from abandoned white plantations, and they opened their own businesses during the period of Reconstruction. As discriminatory Jim Crow laws took hold, they increasingly isolated themselves in communities along the coastal corridor to maintain their independence, especially on the Barrier Islands, where their descendants settled for generations and worked as farmers and fishermen. Well, these descendants of West African slaves became known as Gullah or Geechee. Now, the name's origin is not definitively known, although Gullah may derive from Gola and Geechee from Kisi, which were two of the tribes along the West African rice coast from where many of the slaves were taken. Today, Gullah tends to be the preferred name in North and South Carolina for these people, while Geechee refers to the islanders of Georgia and Florida. And in total, their population is about 200,000. Well, also distinct from tropical climate regions on the more inland plantations, the sugar and tobacco plantations of the South, enslaved Africans and their descendants in the Low Country experienced greater rates of survival and childbirth, probably because they weren't worked as hard. Black populations often became the majority in the coastal communities, which increased their ability as first slaves and then freedmen to maintain their traditions and kinship support systems that were heavily influenced by West and West Central African roots. Well, passing these cultural traditions on to new generations was instrumental in forming the Gullah Geechee culture of the Low Country. Well, working in the coastal land as subsistence farmers in poor rural communities, later as commercial farmers, they brought produce to towns and cities. They grew vegetables like tomatoes and collards and cabbage and peas, and they raised hogs and chickens. Working the tidal estuaries and salt marshes, they harvested oysters in the winter and caught crab in the summer. One of these successful seafood businesses, which was begun on former plantation land with lots made available to the freedmen, was located not far from Savannah, Georgia. And this business thrived for 60 years until 1985. During that time, it expanded to also include boat building and net knitting, crab trap making, and preparing deviled crab for area restaurants. Well, today, the factory buildings of this business have been converted to the Pinpoint Heritage Museum. And as guides walked with us and described the history of the seafood factory and the traditions, the Gullah language, and the spiritual life of the community, it was evident that they had great pride and commitment to preserving their culture and history. Well, when enslaved Africans were brought to the coastal plantations from West Africa, of course, they represented a cross-section of many different tribes who spoke a multitude of different languages. But they needed to develop a common language because they were working and living together and had such diverse backgrounds, but they needed this common communication. And the result then was the development of the Gullah or Gullah Geechee language. It is English-based as its root, but includes words, phrases, and grammatical elements from various of the African languages of the tribes from where people were taken. As such, it is considered a Creole language that is not simplified pidgin, but a full-fledged language based on the mixing of different languages to form a new one. The vocabulary of Gullah then comes primarily from English, for example, uman for woman, but there are numerous words of African origin, such as niam for eat. The phrase kumbaya, meaning come by here, taken from the song of the same name, is likely of Gullah origin. Well, today, Gullah is spoken by about 5,000 people in coastal South Carolina and Georgia. And for generations, the language was stigmatized as a mark of ignorance and low social status. As a result, Gullah people developed the habit of speaking it only within the confines of their homes and their local communities. Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas is Gullah. We actually visited the village he grew up with. He was raised speaking Gullah in coastal Georgia. Now, when asked why he has little to say during the hearings of the court, he replied that the ridicule he received for his Gullah speech as a young man caused him to develop the habit of listening rather than speaking in public. Well, in recent years, educated Gullah people have begun promoting their language as a symbol of cultural pride. The United Nations voted in 1997 to accept Gullah as the official language of the Gullah Geechee people. In 2017, Harvard University began offering the language in its African language program, and it is the only distinctly African-American Creole language in the United States. Now, the rice and cotton plantations of the Southeast coast, of course, are long gone. Today, their remnants, like this, stand as ghostly reminders of the most successful industries in early America. Some of the coastal and barrier island plantations have been restored and open to visitors. Our visits to these expansive plantation grounds confronted us, though, with the stark difference between the lavishness of mansions like this, of the planter families, and in contrast, the squalid quarters provided for enslaved Africans. Primitive one-room shacks, perhaps with a tiny loft, they were typically built as two attached units, each housing an entire slave family and all of their children. Well, after the Civil War, some of the former slaves actually continued to live and work on land that they now owned, even up to the 20th century. Although their economic position was limited and Jim Crow discrimination laws were prevalent in much of the South, again, it was the remoteness of the island communities that enabled greater opportunity for them to improve their homes, as well as to build their own churches and schools with children taught by Black teachers. The Gullah Geechee culture lives on. It is promoted by schools, museums, and groups dedicated to teaching their history to the next generation and preserving aspects of their music, their dance, their crafts, their food, their stories, and their religion. The footprint of the Gullah Geechee culture can be found all along the southeastern US coast. In 2006, an act of the United States Congress established the Gullah Geechee Cultural Heritage Corridor as a platform for sharing their history and culture. It is the only national heritage area that has a group of people as its subject, and it includes the Barrier Islands from southern North Carolina to northern Florida and extends approximately 30 miles inland. And the Gullah Geechee, to promote and preserve their culture, have established sister city relationships with some of the West African Rice Coast cities. For example, Charleston, South Carolina is a sister city to Freetown, Sierra Leone, where many of the enslaved people were taken from. Homecomings have been organized to strengthen bonds and family relationships between the Gullah Geechee communities in the US and their roots in Sierra Leone and other West African countries. Some of the most poignant experiences have occurred when American visitors speaking their Gullah Creole have met Africans speaking their native Creole tribal language and have identified many similarities. They were not only able to understand each other, but found that they were also singing identical songs passed down through the generations on each side of the Atlantic Ocean. Well, the Gullah culture today is evident in many ways. It can be seen in the sweetgrass baskets that were vital to the rice economy and became a distinctive art form of the Gullah people. These sweetgrass baskets are coiled. They are made from a long-bladed coastal grass of the southeastern states, and they are indeed nearly identical to baskets made by the Wolof tribe in Senegal, West Africa. Well, their low country ancestors used a basket that looked like this, wide and flat, called fanner baskets, which were used for winnowing rice, that is, separating the kernel from the chaff. The baskets were woven, today they're woven in many different shapes. They're quite beautiful. They've significantly risen in price in recent years because sweetgrass supplies have virtually disappeared with the decline of the coastal savanna habitat. This also then affects the legacy of their craft for future generations, since basket makers can no longer afford to give their children sweetgrass to play with when they first express interest in learning how to make the baskets. But there are many other customs and traditions which tie the Gullah Geechee to their West African ancestors. For example, the ring shout is a transcendent religious ritual derived from African melody and dance in which worshipers move in a circle while shuffling and stomping their feet and clapping their hands. It is the root of Southern square dancing. The Gullah built one-room praise houses and churches to worship with their energetic singing. Gullah spirituals employ what's known as the call and response method, commonly performed also in West and Central African tribes. In terms of food, Gullah rice dishes, such as red rice and gumbo soup, are very similar to West African dishes called jollof rice and okra soup. Gullah beliefs about hags are similar to African beliefs about malevolent ancestors, witches, and devils. It was believed that angry spirits were afraid of water. As a result, slaves would paint their shutters blue or hang blue bottles, imitating water from tree branches adjacent to their cabin to scare away evil spirits. The Gullah Geechee culture represents a vital chapter of American and Black history. And as we traveled the Heritage Corridor, we visited several places that today are historic, artistic, and oral repositories of the Gullah Geechee. Foremost among them is the Penn Center on St. Helena Island, South Carolina. Penn Center was founded in 1862 by Quaker and Unitarian missionaries from Pennsylvania. It was named for William Penn, the Quaker champion for human liberty, and of course, the founder of Pennsylvania. The Penn Center is the first school in the southern United States that was built specifically for the education of newly freed slaves. And it remained an active educational institution for the island's population until 1948. Today, it continues with an educational mission for the Gullah Geechee people, maintaining a museum, a cultural center, and conference meeting space, as well as promoting civil rights. Well, in Savannah, Georgia, the King Tisdale Cottage interprets Black life in the region to celebrate the contributions of African Americans, especially those in the Sea Islands of Georgia and South Carolina. These markers, for example, were used to identify safe houses for slaves who were escaping north along the Underground Railroad. However, while the mission to promote the Gullah Geechee Heritage Corridor is certainly strongly presented and proudly admired by institutions such as these, we encountered, despite my considerable research, both before and during my visit, few places that had adequate descriptions or even well-maintained exhibits, and consequently, there were few visitors. Even more disturbingly, the Gullah Geechee way of life is increasingly threatened by development on the islands for gated communities, giant resorts, and fancy golf courses. As one resident complained to me, there was a time when most people didn't want these areas because they were infested with mosquitoes, and now everybody wants it. On some of the barrier islands, such as Hilton Head and St. Helena Island in South Carolina, the Gullah, who formerly lived in tight-knit communities with families who shared land passed down through generations, have almost entirely disappeared. The first bridge to the islands wasn't built until 1930, but now nearly all are easily accessible by multi-lane causeways. Gullah parents often left no more than oral wills, telling their children never to sell the land, but to share it with their siblings and live on it. Many did, and because the children shared ownership and often passed it down to their children, the specifics of land ownership have gotten murky. Some children who owned shares moved away, and that left those who stayed behind with the burden of paying property taxes. In addition, because of the shared ownership, many Gullah people can't get mortgages to build homes on their property. The result is that many bought trailers or chose to relocate. Now, in the past, the Gullah could survive with some farming or fishing. Nowadays, though, there are more government regulations that limit the shrimp, oysters, and fish that can be caught. Tourists are overfishing for oysters and shrimp, and land clearing for expensive homes is removing oyster and shrimp habitat along the wetland's edge. Now, the one significant exception to this trend is Sapelo Island in Georgia. Sapelo has resisted outside development in part because most of the land is an ecological reserve. Only 3% is occupied, principally by the village of Hog Hammock, occupied by the Gullah Geechee. This is one of the last Gullah Geechee communities along the coast whose mission is to increase awareness that Sapelo has existed as a Gullah community for over 200 years. Another thing that protects this community is the fact that there is no bridge connecting Sapelo Island with the mainland. Thus, it is only accessible by ferry boat or private aircraft, and this has fortunately also discouraged resort development. Tourist visits are strictly controlled. Visitors are required to register beforehand with a Gullah resident before receiving permission to take the ferry. Nevertheless, the Gullah population on Sapelo Island is small. There are fewer than 50 full-time residents today. All supplies must be brought from the mainland or purchased in a small general store on the island. A few of the local Gullah residents prepare meals for visitors in their homes. And school children on the island must also take the ferry and then a bus because the island school, the only one, closed in 1978. Well, in summary, the Gullah Geechee are, to be sure, a unique group of African Americans historically isolated in remote island and coastal lands. They therefore had much less contact with white colonists and therefore were able to preserve their African language and community life. The Gullah culture started as disparate Africans forcibly brought to the New World, applied their specialized skills, and figured out how to mesh together all of their traditions, languages, and religious beliefs under often extremely hostile situations. Well, despite the erosion of their communities during the past few decades, they exhibited to us a sense of self-assurance and pride. They have begun now to speak their Gullah Creole more openly and have even opened businesses with Gullah or Geechee in the title. We encountered them leading tours on plantations and sharing their wealth of knowledge about how the Gullah culture first developed, rather than just focusing on the white planter class narrative. And they are also representing Gullah culture in the arts. As one of our guides told us, where before Gullah was a thing you didn't want to be, now it's like, I'm Gullah, and I have such gratitude to see that embrace. Thank you very much. All right.
Wow, thank you. I learned so much. That was just excellent. I so appreciate it. I don't see questions that came through the chat, but if people want to unmute and ask a question or raise their hand and Barry can acknowledge you, that would be great.
Yeah, usually takes a few minutes for people to catch their breath and develop a question.
Did you go to that island where it is so restricted?
I did, yes, I did. I arranged it in advance. There are a couple of different Gullah people who give tours of the island, and I did arrange that from Boston. It's also, I guess, possible to stay overnight at one of the private houses. I did not do that, but I went on a full tour of the island and saw the community of Gullah, and also saw much of the landscape and heard many of the stories from the guide.
And it's called Sapelo Island?
Sapelo, S-A-P-E-L-O.
Huh. I'd like to go there.
It's a very worthwhile place to go, yes. Yeah.
And it was a wonderful talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So we have a question about how did the resorts acquire the lands from the Gullah? Well, they bought them. And, you know, there was a lot of question about property ownership at the time. There were many generations. It was hard for them to keep title and deed to their property and build homes. Many of them needed the money after some of their businesses started to fail. And the resorts recognized how valuable places like Hilton Head, how valuable these lands were for golf courses, for recreation, for just admiring the beauty, and they wanted to build these resorts. And so they came in and dangled lots of cash in front of their eyes, and many people, because the communities weren't protected in other ways by the government, many of the people there sold out to those developers. Cumberland, yes, there is a connection between the Rockefellers and Sapelo, and the Barrier Islands. They had property there, I think, but I don't specifically know about Cumberland Island because that was not one of the islands I visited.
Is this near the islands that has the ponies?
No, the islands that have ponies are way up in Virginia. That's Assateague and Chettateague.
Right.
That's much further. That's in Virginia. That's much further. Yeah, so MLK and the Penn School, of course, have a very strong relationship. Martin Luther King Jr. did have an affiliation with the school and did come to speak there on several occasions. He was proudly supported the work that the school was doing in promoting the Gullah Geechee culture and African American culture and education in that area.
I'd like to ask, is Sapelo, I think they may have Rhodes Scholar trips that include a visit to Sapelo Island. Is that?
Well, I'm not familiar with them specifically, but I wouldn't be surprised because Sapelo is certainly the best representation and the best preserved of the islands promoting the Gullah Geechee culture that has not had incursions from the big resort developers. So yes, I would not be surprised if that in fact is part of a Rhodes Scholar tour.
And is Sapelo the place where Pat Conroy went and taught for a year and then wrote a book about that experience?
Yeah, I'm not sure if Pat Conroy, if that was the island that he used in the book, but Pat Conroy, of course, who is from that area, is much beloved because of his writing. Everybody knows about Pat Conroy. And yeah, his books certainly convey the essence and culture of that region. But I don't know if specific, yeah.
On one of the islands for a year. I forget the name of the book he wrote about it, but I think he did that.
Yeah, it may have been Sapelo, although I tend to think not, but that's something I need to check. Another question, how are the barrier islands threatened by more intense storms? Certainly they are, and as there have been hurricanes that have come up the coast, the barrier islands do have storm surges, which have destroyed a lot of the land there and have had flooding. So yes, global warming is also, and more intense, rising sea levels and more intense storms are threatening the islands more and more each year. Question to me about how I learned about the Gullah people. I had heard about them or read about them over several decades and had always wanted to go and learn more by visiting these islands. But my trip planning always fell below desire to see international places in the world. And of course, now during COVID, this provided the ideal time to go and finally make a trip to the region. And I learned a lot from reading and from speaking with the people there and going to some of the museums there. My trip, how long was my trip? It was 3 weeks, and yes, I had a car, although of course you go by boat to Sapelo. The car, I did not drive from Boston. I flew to Savannah and then traveled from there through Georgia and South Carolina. Yeah, so a very good question. How do the Gullah Geechee hope to preserve their culture and community if they have no communal property and community government going forward? Have they ever applied for a reservation? Yeah, they have not applied for a reservation per se. Certainly, now that they're part of a formally recognized by Congress Gullah Geechee community, they qualify for a number of loans and monies that are given to them for the development of their museums, the development of their culture. But your question is very timely, because indeed, with certainly they own property there, but with the pressures, modern day pressures of resort developers, like have occurred on Hilton Head and a few of the other islands, it's very, very difficult for many of them to sustain that cultural identity and to stay there unless they do get some government protection. And, you know, I think part of their effort to highlight the importance of their community and culture will go then a long way in government policy to then protect them, recognizing how important it is for the preservation of their community and their people. So they're trying to promote this, and with knowledge then comes recognition of the significance, historic significance of what occurred down there and how their communities developed. And the hope is that the government will step in and try to then protect them or give them grants that maybe property tax exemptions or other types of things that will enable them to be financially stable and to stay on their property. So the population trends for the Gullah, they've stayed, well, they've stayed pretty stable as a population, but many of the communities, like on Sapelo, which are now down to about 50 residents, have diminished as people have just found it more difficult to sustain. A lot of the people living in the Gullah communities are older people who are retired, and that works for them, but their children often are faced with few employment opportunities, and they have been moving, trying to protect their culture, but moving away from these areas. And if not living on the islands, living in the coastal areas, which are still part of the Gullah Geechee corridor, and working there. Towns like Brunswick in South Carolina, for example, larger places where they have more opportunities for work. But yet I found that their families still promote them. People are very proud, were very proud to tell me that they belong to the Gullah Geechee community, even if they weren't specifically living on the land of their ancestors. There was somebody mentioned about a book called God, Dr. Buzzard and the Bolito Man, about Gullah Geechee culture medicine. Well, I'm going to write that down. I have not heard, I haven't even come across that title. If you have any, Carol, if you have any more information about that and what that book conveyed, that would be great. I've never heard of that book about the Gullah Geechee culture medicine. There is a great video on YouTube. It's called Gullah Roots, and it talks about the Gullah Geechee community, their history, and some of the exchanges they have made between sister cities in the United States and in Sierra Leone, from where many of the people were brought, enslaved people were brought. So, that's really a great source of background information on the Gullah. Tom says, when we were in Belize, we learned that there's a group called the Garifuna who migrated from other islands. Are they related to the Gullah Geechee? Not that I'm familiar with. I did not come across anything about that in my travels there. All right. Well, I thank you all very much, and hope this was interesting and informative. It's about people who are, unlike when I talk about people in far-flung places, these people are basically in our backyard, so to speak. And I think it's really interesting to learn about their background and how they've thrived.
Yes, I'm sure everybody agrees. This was an excellent presentation. Very well done. Yes, thank you, Barry.
Thank you very much.
We look forward to another one, maybe in person in the fall.
That was lovely.
Thank you.
Thank you all very much.
All right.